The rain fell in steady, heavy sheets against the windows of the old town hall, a building whose age and grandeur only enhanced the sense of foreboding that hung over the town of Westford. The rooms inside were dimly lit, a perfect reflection of the gloom that had settled over the lives of its residents since the night of the murder. The body of Florence Bellamy, the town's beloved librarian, was discovered in the rare books section, sprawled across the floor, her face frozen in an expression of horror. It was a peculiar scene, no sign of forced entry, no weapon found, and no obvious cause of death. But the strangest thing was the verse, written in pencil, in perfect handwriting. On the wall above her head was a poem, only a few lines, but they seemed to tell a tale of despair and loss. The end is near, but here I stand, a victim of my own hand, yet not in truth, the hand of fate, the end of time, a twisted state. The verse made no sense. It could have been a cryptic clue or a frantic last thought. But how did the killer know about it? Why had they left it behind? More questions swirled in the air than answers, and when Chief Inspector Henry Ellsworth arrived on the scene, he was already certain of one thing: this case would not be solved by the ordinary methods of investigation. Ellsworth was a man who thrived on puzzles, but this one was different. There was no straightforward way to begin. The room itself, locked from the inside, gave no hint as to how the murderer could have escaped. The windows were sealed tight, and the door was bolted when the body was discovered. It was as if Florence had simply vanished, leaving only the strange poem behind as a clue. The local constables had already combed the area, but nothing seemed to add up. Ellsworth knew there was more to this crime than met the eye, and he wasn't willing to leave any stone unturned. He had been called to solve cases like this before, where the ordinary explanations were insufficient, and only the extraordinary would do. He stood in the middle of the room, inspecting the walls, the floor, the desk that had been overturned in what looked like an almost theatrical manner. The bookshelves, once neat and organized, had been disrupted, but nothing seemed to have been stolen. The strangest thing was the floor. One of the old, heavy volumes of a detective novel had been left open near her body, its pages torn, as though someone had been interrupted mid-read. The only clue was the verse. Ellsworth paced slowly around the room, his mind racing, trying to understand what had happened. He noticed the only light in the room, the old oil lamp on the desk, had been extinguished, but there were no signs of struggle. The dead woman had been alone, and the manner of death was odd. No visible marks, no bruises, no gunshot wound. In fact, the only unusual thing about her body was the peculiar, almost theatrical expression on her face, a look of terror, yet not of physical pain. The police had questioned everyone who had access to the room, but there were only two possibilities: Florence Bellamy, or someone who had known the library inside and out. The caretaker, Mr. Finch, an elderly man with a love for the building's history, had been the one to find the body. Yet he had been in the kitchen at the time of the murder, and he had a solid alibi. Ellsworth sat down at the desk, his eyes scanning the room again, picking apart each detail. There was something about this case that felt rehearsed, as though it had been set up to fit a particular pattern. His thoughts turned to the verse once more, the repetition of the word hand. The hand of fate, the hand of time. It was too much to be a coincidence. A suspect who had a deep knowledge of literature, someone who would understand the symbolism of the words, the precise location, the way everything had been arranged. That's when it hit him. The verse was a clue, but not to a traditional motive. It was a message, a carefully constructed riddle, meant to mislead. Florence Bellamy hadn't died at random. Her death was part of something much bigger, a tragic series of events orchestrated by someone who had been planning it for much longer than anyone could imagine. Ellsworth rose from the desk, his mind focused now. He needed to speak to someone who could understand the significance of the verse, a scholar, a poet, someone with the kind of intellectual rigor to decipher the deeper meaning hidden in those lines. He needed to talk to Dr. Helena Westbrook, the town's leading historian, and a professor of literature at the university. She was a woman of sharp wit, known for her analytical mind and her ability to unravel even the most perplexing texts. It wasn't long before Ellsworth stood in front of Dr. Westbrook's office, His mind racing, she listened carefully to his recounting of the murder, then nodded as though she already knew something he didn't. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice smooth but edged with curiosity. "The poem. I recognized the style as soon as you mentioned it." "You do?" Ellsworth asked, surprised. Dr. Westbrook leaned forward, her fingers steepled in thought. "Yes, it's a very specific type of writing, connected to a certain literary tradition from the early 20th century. Florence would have been familiar with it. She was an avid reader of obscure texts." Ellsworth raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "These lines, Inspector, they aren't just random words. They're a reference to the works of an obscure poet, one who believed in fate and the manipulation of time. His name was Julian Blackwood, and he wrote extensively on the inevitability of death. His final work, unpublished, was about a woman who was destined to die in a locked room, alone, surrounded by the very things she loved. It was said that anyone who read that final manuscript would be marked by fate itself." Ellsworth's heart raced. Was it possible that Florence had somehow found the manuscript? Or had someone wanted to recreate this grim tale? "Where can I find this manuscript?" Ellsworth demanded. Dr. Westbrook looked up at him, her face pale. "You won't find it. It was believed to be lost, but I fear that someone has found it, and, in doing so, has set this grim prophecy into motion." Ellsworth's mind was already moving forward, piecing together the clues, connecting them to the darker corners of the town's history. He had no answers yet, but he knew that the truth was more complicated than any of them could have imagined. It was a matter of time before the pieces fell into place, and the real killer, hidden behind layers of deception, would reveal themselves. The case was far from over, and now, it seemed, Ellsworth was caught in the middle of something far larger than a simple murder. The next day, as the gray clouds still loomed ominously above, Chief Inspector Ellsworth returned to the crime scene. The sense of urgency in his chest was palpable, the weight of the case pressing heavily upon his shoulders. He wasn't sure what exactly he was looking for, but he knew that something was off. Something small, yet critical, was waiting to be uncovered. The scene inside the library had not changed. The officers had been thorough, cataloging everything with meticulous precision, but it felt as if the room itself was holding its breath, as though it was waiting for someone to unravel its secrets. Ellsworth stood just inside the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the room, every displaced book, every glint of light that caught on a dusty surface. The constables were still at work, sifting through the various stacks of books, trying to see if they could find something hidden between the pages. But Ellsworth was aware that the key to this case wasn't going to be found in any of those places. It wasn't in the words Florence had left behind or in the mess left by the intruder. It was in the subtle details, the things that were out of place. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the desk where Florence's body had been found. The open book, the one that had been left near her hand, was still there. He leaned over it, his fingers skimming the edges of the pages. It was a detective novel, The Murder at the Tower, by a little-known author named Vincent Gardner. Ellsworth paused, his mind briefly drifting back to the verse, the strange poem left on the wall. It was too perfect, too deliberate, too connected, to the kind of story that someone like Florence, with her deep love of literature, might enjoy. He had been so caught up in the literary references that he hadn't fully processed the book on the desk. But now, looking at the cover, a subtle detail caught his attention. The spine of the book was slightly bent, not from age, not from being poorly handled, but from being pressed down as though someone had forced the book open at a specific page. He opened the book, and sure enough, the pages between the first and second chapters had been dog-eared. The creases were fresh to have been there for long. "Constable, come here," Ellsworth called, his voice sharp. The young officer approached cautiously, aware of the inspector's growing intensity. "Yes, Sir." Ellsworth flipped open the pages, revealing a line of text that had been carefully underlined. The words were nothing special, just a line from the second chapter, something about the inevitability of fate. But the indentation on the page was too deep to be accidental. Someone had pressed hard enough to leave a lasting mark, a mark that had been purposefully concealed under the cover of the book. Someone was here, Ellsworth muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The thought stirred a sense of cold clarity. Florence hadn't been alone when she died. The murderer had been here long enough to manipulate the scene, to plant clues, and distort the evidence in a way that could mislead any investigator. Search the rest of the books, Ellsworth instructed the constable, and check the pages carefully. Look for anything that's been marked or tampered with. The constable nodded, and Ellsworth continued to walk around the room, his eyes scanning for anything else that might be out of place. As he passed the bookshelves, something else caught his eye, a small leather-bound journal, slightly askew among the otherwise perfectly lined books. He moved toward it, plucking it from the shelf with careful hands. The journal was old, but it wasn't a library book. It wasn't part of Florence's collection. In fact, it seemed out of place entirely. He flipped it open, and his gaze landed on the first entry. Julian Blackwood has warned me. The curse is real, and I am not the first to be touched by it. The verse is the key. Ellsworth froze. He had heard the name Blackwood before, but it had only been a fleeting reference, buried in the context of Florence's reading. It was a name that didn't seem to fit in with the quiet life of a librarian. The journal's author, however, clearly believed in something far darker, something tied to the very curse that Dr. Westbrook had mentioned. The detective's mind raced. Florence Bellamy wasn't just a random victim. She had been involved in something much deeper, something that, as far as Ellsworth could tell, involved more than one person. He knew he was only at the edge of the web, and it was about time. He found out who had woven it. Just as he closed the journal, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Mr. Finch, the elderly caretaker, who had been standing by the door for some time, quietly watching. Inspector Ellsworth," he began, hesitating slightly. "There's something I didn't mention earlier. Something strange." Ellsworth turned toward him, his brow furrowing. "What is it, Mr. Finch?" The caretaker shuffled nervously, glancing around the room as though ensuring no one else was listening. "It's about the night she died. I saw someone in the library that night, a woman, but it wasn't Florence. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed it was a visitor. But now," Ellsworth's interest peaked. "Who was this woman, Mr. Finch? What did she look like?" I couldn't see her clearly. She was wearing a hood, but there was something unsettling about her. She seemed to be waiting, as though she was expecting something or someone." Ellsworth felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The caretaker had only seen the woman briefly, but her presence could explain a great deal. It was possible that Florence had been involved in something secretive, something tied to the book, the verse, and this mysterious woman. "Do you have any idea who she might have been?" Ellsworth asked, his tone measured. Finch shook his head. "I didn't get a good look at her, but when I saw her, she was standing near the window, watching the rain. I remember thinking how strange it was, because Florence had always been so punctual. I never imagined she'd have company at that hour." Ellsworth knew this wasn't just a coincidence. The woman in the hood, the book, the verse, it was all leading him somewhere, though he wasn't sure where yet. But one thing was certain: Florence's death had been part of a much larger puzzle, and someone was manipulating every piece to fit their twisted narrative. He glanced back at the journal in his hands. It was clear that the woman Finch had seen was connected to Blackwood in some way. But how? The answers were still hidden beneath layers of deception, and the detective knew that the key to unlocking the truth was lying just out of reach. The first threads of the web were now clearly visible, but the full picture remained a shadowy, elusive blur. Ellsworth only hoped he could untangle it before anyone else paid the price. The following morning, the town of Westford seemed unchanged. The skies had cleared. The damp streets gleamed under the soft morning light, and the usual bustle of townsfolk going about their day created the illusion that life had returned to normal. But for Chief Inspector Ellsworth, the weight of the investigation pressed heavily upon him. Each hour seemed to unravel more, yet the answers were as elusive as ever. The verses, the journal, the mysterious woman, all these pieces danced on the periphery of the truth, but nothing was clear enough to draw a definitive conclusion. With determination in his stride, Ellsworth returned to the town hall. His mind was still racing from the caretaker's strange words the night before. The hooded woman had been a significant detail, and yet, no one seemed to know who she was. If someone was trying to manipulate Florence's death, they were doing it well, staying just far enough away from the truth to evade capture. It was time to bring in the suspects, the witnesses, and anyone else who might have seen something or who might be hiding something. Ellsworth's first stop was the library's staff. The 3 employees who had been working the evening Florence died were gathered in a small room at the back of the building. They all seemed on edge, but their nervous energy only seemed natural. The death of someone they'd worked closely with for so long had left them unsettled. And no one could deny that. The first to speak was Peter, a lanky young man with glasses too large for his face. He seemed to be the most eager to cooperate, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I was in the back room when it happened, Chief Inspector. I swear, I didn't hear anything strange, but when I came out to check on Florence, she was already..." He trailed off, his voice shaking. Ellsworth narrowed his eyes, sensing a bit too much enthusiasm in Peter's eagerness to be helpful. "You didn't hear anything unusual? Not even the sound of someone entering the library?" Peter shook his head quickly. "No, nothing. It was just a normal night. And you didn't see anyone?" Ellsworth pressed, his gaze never leaving Peter's face. "No one in a hooded cloak? Someone unfamiliar?" Peter seemed to falter for a moment, his eyes darting to his colleagues. No one like that. I didn't see anything strange at all." The detective kept his gaze steady, watching as Peter's lips twitched, a telltale sign of nerves. There was something off in his response, but Ellsworth wasn't about to jump to conclusions. He needed to hear from the others. He turned his attention to the next staff member, Amanda. She was a quiet woman in her early 30s, with sharp, calculating eyes and an air of calm that contrasted sharply with Peter's frantic energy. She sat straight-backed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I was upstairs cataloging some of the new books when it happened," Amanda said, her voice calm but with a hint of strain. "I didn't hear anything from below, but I did come down when Mr. Finch called out that the police had been alerted." "And you didn't see anything suspicious either?" Ellsworth asked. "No," Amanda replied, her eyes unwavering. "I didn't see anyone out of the ordinary." Ellsworth didn't push her further. There was a quiet composure about Amanda that gave him a sense of discomfort. She seemed too perfect in her answers to detach from the horror of Florence's death. He turned his gaze to the 3rd employee, a young woman named Clara, who had been working the late shift. Clara's hands were trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she appeared exhausted, her face a mask of sorrow. I just don't understand it," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. She was like a second mother to me. I was with her earlier in the evening. We spoke about some new acquisitions, and she seemed fine. And then her voice broke, and she looked away, her lip trembling. "I don't know what happened." Ellsworth watched her for a moment, before speaking again. "Clara, do you recall anything unusual? Anyone acting suspiciously? Or any unusual behavior from Florence that night?" Clara shook her head vigorously. "No, nothing. But I know someone was there. Someone who shouldn't have been. Florence wouldn't have just let anyone in after hours." "Who do you think it was?" Ellsworth asked, leaning forward. I don't know," Clara admitted, her face pale. "But I felt it, like a shadow in the room. I can't explain it. Maybe it was the woman." The detective's pulse quickened. "The woman?" he repeated. "What woman?" Clara hesitated, then spoke in a near whisper. "I saw her once before. She was at the library, and I saw her talking to Florence. She looked familiar, but not in a good way. Like someone who had been here before, but didn't belong." Ellsworth was about to press her further when the door to the small room opened, and Mr. Finch stepped in. His face drawn and weary, the elderly man shuffled toward Ellsworth, his eyes darting nervously around the room before resting on the detective. "Inspector," Mr. Finch said quietly, "I've been thinking. I might know who the woman is." Ellsworth's interest piqued. "Who is she, Mr. Finch?" Finch lowered his voice as though afraid the walls might hear. "Her name is Evelyn Blackwood. She's a relative of Julian Blackwood the poet. She was seen in the town years ago, but she disappeared after a scandal. Ellsworth frowned. What kind of scandal? Finch hesitated, then sighed. She was involved with a man who was, well, not a man of good character. There were rumors of foul play, but nothing was ever proven. She left after that, and no one ever heard from her again. Until now, the name sent a shiver down Ellsworth's spine. Evelyn Blackwood. The very name that had been tied to the cursed manuscript and the strange verse. He knew that if this woman was involved, everything about this case was more complex than he had imagined. I need to speak with her, Ellsworth said firmly. Where can I find her? Mr. Finch looked nervous. I don't know. I haven't seen her since that time, but if she's back in town, she's most likely hiding somewhere. I wouldn't be surprised if she's been lurking in the shadows for some time. Ellsworth nodded slowly, his mind racing. The contradictions were starting to pile up, each new revelation adding another layer of complexity to the case. Peter's eagerness to assist seemed manufactured. Amanda's calmness seemed calculated. Clara's vague recollections hinted at something darker. And now, this mysterious Evelyn Blackwood, her connection to Julian Blackwood's cursed writings, and her possible role in Florence's death seemed more and more likely. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the three staff members. I'll be looking into this, Evelyn Blackwood, Ellsworth said. But in the meantime, I suggest you all stay out of contact with each other, and don't leave town. As he walked out of the room, the sense of deception grew stronger. Each of these witnesses and suspects was hiding something, their stories twisted and incomplete. The detective knew that he was getting closer to the truth, but the closer he came, the more dangerous it seemed. The threads were weaving tighter, and it was only a matter of time before the full picture would emerge, one that would either shatter the quiet life of Westford or expose something far more sinister. Lurking beneath its surface, the early afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the small office in the town hall. As Chief Inspector Ellsworth sat alone, the silence of the room pressing in around him. He had been reviewing his notes for hours, the details of each witness's statement and every contradictory remark slowly forming a puzzle that grew more complicated by the minute. The more he delved into the lives of those closest to Florence Bellamy, the more tangled the threads of motive became. Greed, jealousy, revenge, they all seemed to have a place in this case. Yet none of the possibilities offered a clear answer. Peter, the young assistant, had seemed so eager to help, yet his nervousness lingered beneath the surface as though he knew more than he was letting on. Was it guilt, or simply fear of getting caught up in something bigger than he had bargained for? Amanda, the quiet and composed librarian, had a cool detachment that made her answers feel rehearsed, almost too perfect. And Clara, the troubled young woman who had worked closely with Florence, had been hiding something, perhaps a deeper connection to the victim that she wasn't willing to reveal. But it was Mr. Finch's words that had unsettled him the most. Evelyn Blackwood. Her name kept echoing in Ellsworth's mind. A relative of the elusive Julian Blackwood, a woman with ties to a scandalous past, and possibly the key to understanding the murder. The detective had been digging into the history of the Blackwood family, and the more he learned, the more it seemed as though they were at the heart of this mystery. But where did Evelyn fit into all of this? And why had she resurfaced now? Ellsworth leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of his desk as he considered his next move. He needed to talk to Evelyn Blackwood, find out if she had been the woman Clara had seen, and if so, what her motivations might be. But before he could pursue that lead, there were still loose ends to tie up. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the local constabulary. Within minutes, Officer Thompson answered, his voice crackling over the line. Thompson, Ellsworth said, I need a full background check on Evelyn Blackwood. I want to know everything, her last known whereabouts, any family ties, connections to Florence Bellamy, and anything else that might be relevant. Right away, Inspector, Thompson replied, sensing the urgency in Ellsworth's voice. As Ellsworth hung up the phone, he turned his attention back to his notes. The more he thought about the connections, the more the situation seemed to unfold. Like a maze, everyone had a motive, but the true reason for Florence's death remained elusive. Greed was one possibility. Florence had been well-liked, well-respected, and perhaps even wealthy. Her personal library was filled with rare books items that would fetch a high price on the black market. But was this enough of a motive for murder? It didn't feel right. If the killer had been after money, they would have taken the books, or at least ransacked the library more thoroughly. But nothing had been stolen, nothing at all. Revenge was another possibility. Florence had been a woman of strong opinions. Known for her quick wit and sharp tongue, she had made enemies over the years, particularly with some of the more conservative members of the town council. But no one had seemed to harbor enough ill will to kill her, at least not for something so trivial. Jealousy, however, seemed more plausible. Florence had always been the center of attention at the library, the intellectual leader of the town. She had been a mentor to many, including Peter and Clara. It was possible that one of them had harbored unspoken resentment toward her, jealous of her influence, her intellect, or the way she had garnered the respect of everyone around her. But the more Ellsworth thought about it, the more this theory seemed inadequate as well. Florence had never been cruel to them, if anything. She had been generous with her knowledge and time. Then there was fear of exposure, fear of being tied to something darker. Evelyn Blackwood, with her ties to the Blackwood family and their murky past, could be part of a much larger web of deception. Florence might have uncovered something dangerous in her research, or perhaps in her connections to people like Amanda, who had shown a surprising level of indifference when questioned about the murder. Was she hiding something, or was she merely playing her role in a greater scheme? Ellsworth stood up, pacing slowly across the room, his thoughts colliding and clashing like the storm that still brewed outside. Every suspect had a motive, but no one had a clear reason to kill Florence. No one had a perfect alibi, and each of them had something to hide. It was as if they were all playing parts in a much larger game, a game where the stakes were higher than any of them could understand. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Thompson, holding a manila folder in his hands. "Inspector," Thompson said, handing the folder over, "I've got the report on Evelyn Blackwood." Ellsworth took the folder and began flipping through the pages. The more he read, the more it seemed that Evelyn was indeed the key to understanding the tangled web of deception. She had been involved in several criminal investigations in the past, mostly financial scams and shady business dealings, but there was more, much more. Evelyn had been briefly married to a man named Gregory Hale, a known criminal who had been involved in the black market trade of rare books. Florence had written extensively about him in her private journals, describing him as a man with a dark, unsettling presence. It seemed that Florence had been researching Hale's connections to the Blackwood family, possibly uncovering something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Ellsworth paused, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a murder, it was about a secret, a hidden world of crime and deception that Florence had inadvertently uncovered. And Evelyn Blackwood, her return to Westford was no coincidence. Florence had been digging into a world that some very powerful people did not want exposed. A sudden realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. He had overlooked something crucial: the poem. The verse Florence had written on the wall before her death, its cryptic message, its references to fate and time, wasn't just a random thought. It was a message, a warning. Florence had known something. She had uncovered something that had put her life in danger, and in her final moments, she had left behind the only clue she could. Ellsworth's heart pounded as he understood the deeper meaning of the verse. The hand of fate. Florence had written, and now he realized it was a metaphor for the forces at play, forces far beyond anything he had imagined. As he closed the folder, Ellsworth felt the weight of the investigation settle over him once again. Every suspect, every witness, every piece of evidence had brought him to this point. But the full picture was still out of reach. He needed to speak to Evelyn Blackwood, but he also needed to be careful. This was no longer just a murder case, it was a battle for the truth. A battle that was about to become far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The maze of motives had finally taken shape, but as Ellsworth stood at the edge of this tangled web, he realized that the real puzzle was just beginning. The rain had returned, falling in heavy sheets against the windows of the town hall, its rhythmic patter a constant reminder of the storm. That seemed to mirror the turmoil within Ellsworth's mind. The breakthrough had come suddenly, almost too easily. It had been a seemingly small piece of evidence, a photograph discovered among Florence Bellamy's personal belongings, tucked inside an old diary. The image showed Evelyn Blackwood standing next to a man who was unmistakably Gregory Hale, the infamous black market dealer. They were smiling, standing close, almost intimately, their shared history evident in their expressions. Ellsworth had been struck by the photograph's simplicity. It wasn't just a casual snapshot, it was a piece of history, one that connected Evelyn directly to the dangerous world that Florence had been investigating. The picture made it clear Florence had been on the trail of something much bigger than anyone had imagined, and now Evelyn Blackwood, with her ties to Gregory Hale, was at the center of it all. Within hours, the police had arrested Evelyn Blackwood. The town buzzed with whispers of the case's imminent closure. The authorities rushed to declare the investigation solved, certain that they had found the culprit, the woman who had resurfaced after years of silence, the woman who had been linked to Florence's murder. But something didn't sit right with Ellsworth. It felt too easy, too neat. The arrest of Evelyn Blackwood had all the markings of a rushed conclusion, one born of desperation rather than careful deduction. The photograph had been compelling, but it was only a single piece of the puzzle. And now, with Evelyn behind bars, there was an unsettling silence that hung in the air. Ellsworth paced the small office, the flickering light of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they had missed something crucial. The arrest had been a victory, yes, but a false one. The real criminal, the one pulling the strings, was still out there, waiting in the shadows. He picked up the file on Evelyn Blackwood again, flipping through it with a sense of growing unease. Yes, she had been married to Gregory Hale, but the more Ellsworth read, the more the connection between them seemed hollow. Evelyn had been involved in shady dealings. Yes, but there was no solid proof linking her to Florence's murder. The photograph was a damning piece of evidence, but it wasn't enough to convict her, not by itself. Ellsworth turned back to the police reports. He had reviewed them so many times he could recite them by heart. The locked room, the missing weapon, the cryptic verse on the wall. He ran his finger over the details once again, looking for something, anything that might explain the nagging doubt in his gut. There was one detail that had never sat right with him: the lack of physical evidence. There had been no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, no clear weapon. Everything pointed to an almost ritualistic murder, one that had been meticulously planned. The sudden thought stopped him cold. Meticulously planned. The killer had been precise, calculated. Florence's death wasn't just a crime of passion or a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated. But how and why? Ellsworth's mind flashed back to the verse, the one that had been written on the wall. The end is near, but here I stand, a victim of my own hand. The last line, a victim of my own hand. Florence had written it, and yet there was something haunting about that phrase. It hadn't been the victim's voice. It was as if someone else had crafted it. Could Florence have been forced to write those words? Could the verse itself have been a trap, a carefully planted clue, meant to mislead him? Ellsworth stood up sharply, the sudden realization hitting him like a wave. The verse had always seemed too obvious, too carefully crafted. He had assumed it was a last desperate message from Florence. But what if the true message was hidden in plain sight? The arrest of Evelyn Blackwood had closed the case for the public, but not for Ellsworth. He couldn't afford to let the town's eagerness cloud his judgment. There were too many loose ends, too many inconsistencies. He grabbed his coat and headed out, a sense of urgency driving him forward. He had to speak to the witnesses again. He had to revisit the crime scene, even if it meant reopening old wounds. Something had been overlooked. He could feel it. The answers were still out there, just beyond his reach, but the clock was ticking. He had no time to waste. The library was quiet when he arrived. The rain had softened to a light drizzle, and the streets outside were nearly deserted. Ellsworth took a deep breath, then pushed the door open, the familiar scent of books and dust filling his lungs. He could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him as he moved through the rows of bookshelves, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He made his way to the rare books section, where Florence's body had been found. The scene had been untouched since the investigation had concluded, and Ellsworth took his time to inspect the area once more, searching for anything that might have been missed. His eyes wandered over the overturned desk, the scattered papers, and the chair where Florence had likely sat in her final moments. Then, something caught his eye, a small piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the desk. It was barely noticeable, hidden among the dust and debris, but it was enough to draw his attention. Ellsworth knelt down and carefully picked it up. Unfolding it with steady hands, the paper was a receipt, but not for anything ordinary. It was a receipt for a book purchased, The Last Prodigy, a rare manuscript that had been sold under the table in a private transaction. Ellsworth knew the book well. It was the kind of book that only collectors or criminals with a specific interest in rare texts would buy, and yet, the receipt was dated just a few days before Florence's death. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what this meant. Florence had been on the trail of something far more dangerous than he had initially realized. The book was tied to the Blackwood family, and possibly to Gregory Hale's criminal network. It wasn't just a piece of literature, it was a key to a much larger operation, one that Florence had uncovered before her death. Ellsworth stood up slowly, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The receipt was a clue, but it wasn't the answer. There was still so much left unexplained. Why had Florence been involved with the book? Who had sold it to her? And why had it been hidden in her office? The answers, Ellsworth knew, were just as elusive as ever. But one thing was certain: the arrest of Evelyn Blackwood had been too quick, too convenient. The case was far from solved. He turned and walked out of the library, the receipt burning a hole in his pocket. The false victory of Evelyn's arrest had given the town a moment of peace, but it was only a temporary illusion. The real criminal remained in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And Ellsworth would be there, watching, waiting for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. Ellsworth's thoughts churned as he walked away from the library. The rain, now a steady drizzle that mirrored the rising tension in his chest. The discovery of the receipt had been important, but it felt like just another piece to a much larger puzzle. Florence's murder had always seemed too simple, too orchestrated for the truth to be so easily wrapped up in one arrest. Evelyn Blackwood might have been involved in something criminal, but she was not the mastermind. He had to dig deeper, pull at the threads of the past to understand the real motives at play. And to do that, he needed to revisit something he had almost forgotten, a case from years ago, one that had once seemed insignificant. As he made his way to the police station, a memory from the past resurfaced. There had been another murder, one that hadn't been fully explained. A case that had gone cold many years before. It was an odd case, one that had slipped under the radar in the rush of larger, more publicized crimes, but it had involved a woman named Clara Fay, a woman who had once worked at the same library. Clara Fay had been a promising young librarian who had disappeared without a trace, shortly before Florence Bellamy had taken over her position. Ellsworth had dismissed it at the time, an isolated incident, nothing to do with the current investigation. But now, with everything that had come to light, the similarities between the two cases were too striking to ignore. Clara Fay's disappearance, Florence's murder, the involvement of rare books, and the shadowy connections to the Blackwood family, everything seemed to be pulling him back to a place he hadn't wanted to revisit. Arriving at the station, Ellsworth called for Officer Thompson and asked him to retrieve the files on Clara Fay's case. It had been years since anyone had looked into it, but the detective knew that sometimes the answers lay buried in old files, waiting to be rediscovered. Thompson returned shortly, carrying a thick file that looked as though it hadn't been touched in ages. He set it down in front of Ellsworth, his face creased with concern. "I didn't know why you wanted to see this, Inspector," Thompson said, glancing nervously at the file. "It's been gathering dust for years. No one ever found anything substantial. But if you think it's connected..." Ellsworth didn't respond right away. He simply opened the file and began reading. Clara Fay had been found dead in a locked room. The circumstances eerily similar to Florence's death. No signs of struggle. No clear cause of death. just the body arranged in a way that seemed almost symbolic. The file noted that her death had been ruled an accident, a misstep on the stairs. But Ellsworth had always found that conclusion unconvincing. And now, with everything he had learned, it didn't sit well at all. As he flipped through the file, one detail caught his eye. Clara Fay had been researching the works of Julian Blackwood, the same man whose legacy seemed to be so intertwined with Evelyn. The librarian had been fascinated with his writings, particularly the unpublished manuscript that had been said to foretell the death of a woman. In a locked room, Clara had even mentioned this manuscript in her last journal entry, noting that she had obtained a rare copy through an anonymous source. The entry was dated just days before her death. Ellsworth sat back in his chair, the file still open in front of him. The connection between Clara's death and Florence's was undeniable. But what did it mean? What was the true link between the two women, and why had Clara Fay's case been closed so quickly? There were too many unanswered questions that had now resurfaced with a vengeance. He thought about the people involved, the suspects, the witnesses. Evelyn Blackwood, Gregory Hale, Peter, Amanda, and Clara. At first glance, they had seemed like isolated figures, each with their own potential motives. But now, with Clara Fay's case coming back into play, Ellsworth began to see the tangled web that connected them all. Evelyn Blackwood's reappearance in town, her ties to Gregory Hale, and her connection to the mysterious manuscript were clearly part of a larger pattern. But Clara's involvement in all of this was a new revelation, one that painted the situation in a far more sinister light. He needed to speak to someone who had known Clara Fay well, someone who might know more about her relationship with the Blackwoods, someone who could shed light on what had really happened before Florence had even entered the picture. The answer came to him almost immediately. Dr. Helena Westbrook, the historian he had consulted earlier. Dr. Westbrook had taught at the university, and she had known Clara Fay. If anyone could provide insight into the connections between the women and the Blackwood family, it was her. Ellsworth wasted no time. He headed straight to Dr. Westbrook's office, hoping that she could offer him the missing link. She greeted him with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting him. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. "I was wondering when you'd come back. I've been reviewing the case," Ellsworth said, not wasting any time with pleasantries. "Clara Fay, you knew her, didn't you?" Dr. Westbrook nodded, her gaze darkening slightly. "Yes, I knew Clara. She was one of my brightest students, but she became obsessed in the end. Obsessed with the works of Julian Blackwood. She was researching him before her death." Ellsworth continued, "I found some old journals. It seems she had obtained a rare manuscript of his before she died. What can you tell me about that?" Dr. Westbrook hesitated before responding. Clara had a peculiar interest in Blackwood's work. She wasn't just fascinated by his writings, she believed in them. She thought his works contained hidden truths, prophecies about fate and death. She believed his final manuscript, the one no one could find, would reveal something profound, something that would change everything. "Do you think she found it?" Ellsworth asked, leaning forward. "Possibly," Dr. Westbrook replied, her voice low. "I tried to warn her. The Blackwood family, especially Evelyn, has always had a dark reputation. There were rumors of curses, of deals made with dangerous people. Clara didn't listen. She thought she could uncover the secrets of the Blackwoods, and now, I fear she might have paid the price for it." Ellsworth felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Clara Fay had been on the trail of something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. And now, so had Florence Bellamy. The past had a way of creeping into the present, and this case was no exception. The deaths of Clara and Florence were connected, but the full scope of their connection was still hidden beneath layers of deception, lies, and old grudges. The detective stood up, his mind racing. The answers were within reach, but the deeper he delved, the more he realized that this was not just about two women, it was about a legacy of darkness that had been buried for years, and it was ready to resurface. The shadows of the past had begun to cast their long, chilling influence over the present, and Ellsworth knew that in order to solve this case, he would need to confront a truth far darker than he had imagined. The tension in Ellsworth's mind had reached a boiling point. With every new revelation, the investigation seemed to unravel further, the threads multiplying into a web so complex that it was impossible to discern where the truth lay. Clara Fay's death, Florence's murder, the Blackwood family, each puzzle piece had only raised more questions. He felt like he was on the edge of something, a truth that was just out of reach, but no matter how he stretched toward it, the answers eluded him. He needed to try something different. Ellsworth was no stranger to the psychology of deception. He had seen it all before: the way suspects fidgeted when they were lying, the way their stories didn't quite add up. But this case was different. These people weren't the usual suspects, ordinary criminals who lied out of fear or greed. No, these were people with hidden motives, long-held secrets, and carefully constructed facadas. It wasn't just about gathering facts, it was about breaking through those walls and forcing the truth to come to light. It was time to apply a different kind of pressure. Ellsworth had already questioned Peter, Amanda, and Clara, but he knew there was still more to learn from them. He also realized that each of them had a different reaction to the murder. Some had been too eager to help, some had been too composed, and some had been hiding behind their grief. The cracks in their stories were subtle, but they were there, waiting to be exploited. His first target was Peter, the young assistant who had been so eager to offer his help. The more Ellsworth thought about it, the more Peter's behavior had felt rehearsed, like someone who had prepared his story in advance. He couldn't shake the feeling that Peter was hiding something, so he decided to apply a little pressure. Ellsworth had arranged to meet Peter in the library under the pretense of discussing the investigation further. He had already made up his mind that he wouldn't be asking Peter any direct questions this time. Instead, he would test the young man's reactions. As Peter arrived at the library, Ellsworth greeted him with a calm, measured demeanor. "Good evening, Peter," he said, his tone friendly yet probing. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. There are still some details I'd like to clear up." Peter seemed nervous, but quickly masked it with a smile. "Of course, Inspector. I'll help however I can." Ellsworth gestured to a nearby chair. "Please sit. I think it's important that we continue where we left off. You told me about the back room and how you didn't hear anything strange, but there's something I didn't ask you about. The key to the library, it's always locked after hours, right?" Peter nodded, his eyes shifting briefly toward the back of the library. "Yes, it's always locked. Florence was very strict about that. Only staff members had keys, and we each had our own set." Ellsworth smiled slightly. "But that's interesting, isn't it? You see, I was talking to the others, and they all mentioned that Florence had a routine. She wouldn't have let anyone in without a good reason, especially not someone she didn't know." Peter's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Yes, I agree. Florence would never let anyone in after hours, not without a reason. It was part of the rules." "But what if someone didn't follow the rules?" Ellsworth continued, leaning forward slightly. "What if someone slipped past the locked doors? Someone with a personal connection to Florence. Someone who knew exactly how to get in without triggering any alarms." Peter's gaze faltered for a brief second, but it was enough. It was a crack in his carefully constructed story. Ellsworth's voice softened. "You're not telling me everything, Peter. I can see it in your eyes. You know more about what happened that night, don't you?" Peter swallowed hard, his hand trembling ever so slightly as it rested on the arm of his chair. He wasn't prepared for this line of questioning. He had been so sure of his rehearsed answers. But now, with Ellsworth's scrutiny bearing down on him, he was beginning to crack. "I don't know what you mean," Peter said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Ellsworth's eyes never left him. "Let me tell you something, Peter. You were the first one to find Florence's body, weren't you? You're the one who called it in. But you didn't mention anything about the key. Why is that? Why didn't you tell me about the key that opens the library door?" Peter's face grew pale, and for a moment, Ellsworth could see the anxiety written clearly across his features. I didn't think it was important," he stammered, clearly caught off guard. "I just assumed it was a detail. That didn't matter. Do you know how many people have access to that key, Peter?" Ellsworth pressed, his voice low and steady. "It's a small group of people. the library's staff, and maybe someone close to Florence, someone she trusted. But you didn't mention it, did you? You didn't mention it because you didn't want to tell me that you have a key. You didn't want me to know that you were there before the others. You were already there, Peter, weren't you?" The silence between them was thick, and for a moment, Peter didn't say anything. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Ellsworth leaned back in his chair, his gaze still unwavering. "You know, Peter, people like to think they can hide the truth with a few well-chosen words. But you can't lie to someone who's paying attention. You can't lie to someone who knows exactly what to look for. You've been hiding something, Peter, and I think it's time you tell me what really happened that night." Peter's breath came in short gasps, and Ellsworth could see the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. The young man looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. I didn't want to get involved," Peter finally whispered, his voice cracking. "But I was there that night. I wasn't supposed to be, but I couldn't stay away, Florence. She was the only one who ever believed in me. She gave me a chance when no one else did." Ellsworth sat quietly, letting Peter's confession hang in the air. He didn't need to rush him. The young man was already crumbling under the pressure. I didn't mean for it to happen," Peter continued, his voice barely audible. "I went to see her, to talk. I wanted to ask for her help again. But when I got there, I found her dead, and I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I told anyone, they'd think I did it." The detective's mind raced. The puzzle finally starting to take shape. Peter had been involved in some way, but there was more to it than just a nervous assistant. Peter's fear, his desperation. This wasn't just about a mistake gone wrong. There were deeper, darker forces at play. "You didn't kill her, did you, Peter?" Ellsworth asked softly, his voice full of understanding, but his eyes sharp. "But you know who did, don't you?" Peter broke down in front of him, his sobs filling the silence. And as Ellsworth watched, he realized the most important thing. Peter wasn't the killer, but he knew who was. Ellsworth's mind was still processing Peter's confession, each new layer adding more complexity to a case that seemed to grow darker. With every turn, the young assistant had been there that night, frightened and guilty, but not the killer. He had seen something, perhaps someone that had made him fear for his life. But Peter hadn't given up the name of the person who had truly committed the murder. That truth still hovered just out of reach, like a shadow creeping along the edges of the room, waiting for the right moment to strike. For the first time in days, Ellsworth felt as though he was on the verge of breaking the case wide open. He had the motive, he had the accomplice, but he still didn't have the full picture. Yet the more he pieced together, the more certain he became. There was someone working against him, someone who wanted to keep the truth buried, and that realization was far more chilling than any of the clues he had uncovered. The case had already cost him his trust in some of the people he'd relied on, but now it seemed to be slipping further away. His suspicions were about to be confirmed when he arrived at the police station the next morning, eager to speak with Officer Thompson and follow up on Peter's statement. He could feel the momentum building, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. But as he walked through the door, he was met with an unexpected sight: an empty desk and a frantic-looking officer standing near the door. "Inspector, you need to see this," the officer said, his voice strained. "There's been a break-in." Ellsworth's stomach sank. He followed the officer down the hallway to the evidence room, his steps quickening as he sensed something was horribly wrong. The door to the evidence room was ajar, and as he entered, the sight that greeted him nearly knocked the wind out of his chest. The room, normally a place of careful order, was in chaos. Shelves were overturned, files strewn about, and the air was thick with the unmistakable scent of disturbed papers. But the most telling sign was the empty space on the table. In the center of the room, the key piece of evidence, the receipt that had linked the rare book, purchased to the Blackwood family, was gone. Ellsworth's heart raced as he stepped forward, inspecting the scene with a growing sense of dread. It wasn't just the missing evidence that bothered him. It was the sheer audacity of it. Someone had gone to great lengths to remove something from the case, something crucial, and they had done it with precision, as if they knew exactly what to take and where to find it. Who had access to this room? Ellsworth demanded, his voice a tight coil of frustration. "Only a few of us, sir," Officer Thompson answered, his face pale. "Myself, the officers on shift, and a couple of detectives. But I swear no one saw anything unusual. It was just last night when we locked up. And now," he stopped, shaking his head. "It's gone." Ellsworth's mind whirled. The theft had been calculated to be a random act. Someone had known exactly what they were looking for, and they had acted swiftly. The receipt had been the thread that tied everything together. The Blackwoods, Gregory Hale, the rare manuscript. Without it, Ellsworth felt as though the case was slipping through his fingers. "I need a list of everyone who had access to this room," Ellsworth said, his voice hardening. Now, as the officers scrambled to gather the information, Ellsworth's mind raced ahead. There had been a leak somewhere. Someone on the inside who had tipped off the person who stole the evidence. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear this wasn't just an ordinary theft. This was sabotage. Whoever had taken the receipt had done so with the intent of stopping him from uncovering the truth. He was beginning to feel the walls close in around him, the weight of the case pressing down harder than ever. But even in the midst of the chaos, one thing remained clear: someone in this town had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, and they weren't about to stop. Now, Ellsworth turned to leave the room, his eyes scanning the evidence shelves one more time. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered a situation where someone had tried to cover their tracks, but this time it felt different. It felt personal, and that made him all the more determined to find the person responsible. The officers at the station were already compiling a list of those with access, but Ellsworth didn't need to wait for their report. He had his suspicions. It was time to confront those who had already given him cause for doubt. Amanda, Peter, Claire, all of them were connected in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. But there was one person who hadn't yet revealed their full hand, someone who had been too quiet to compose from the beginning. The name that echoed in his mind was Evelyn Blackwood. She was in custody, but something told Ellsworth that she knew more than she was letting on. She had the most to lose if the truth came out, and that made her a prime suspect. In this latest development, with a sudden burst of resolve, Ellsworth set out to visit Evelyn once more. He had to see her in person, to confront her directly. His thoughts were racing. He had to know if she had orchestrated the theft of the receipt, or if someone else had done it in her name. The answer lay in her eyes, in her calm demeanor, the way she carried herself despite the mounting pressure. Evelyn Blackwood's cell was in the back of the station, a far cry from the grand estate she had once called home. When Ellsworth arrived, she was sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Inspector," she said coolly, her voice smooth and unbothered. "I was wondering when you'd come to see me again." Ellsworth didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. "I know you didn't kill Florence Bellamy, but I do think you know who did. And I think you've been working very hard to keep certain things from me. Very hard indeed." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Inspector. I've been completely cooperative." "The evidence you tried to bury last night," Ellsworth continued, his voice low and sharp. "You think I don't know someone's been working against me? You think I don't know you've been using your family's influence to keep this whole thing from coming to light?" Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "You're grasping at straws, Inspector. I've been in custody. You can't pin anything on me." Ellsworth's eyes narrowed. "Not yet, Evelyn. But I will." The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time, Ellsworth saw a flicker of doubt in Evelyn's eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. Someone had tried to stop him, and he was closer than ever to finding out who. As he turned to leave, Ellsworth knew one thing for sure: the game had changed. Someone was willing to go to extreme lengths to keep the truth buried. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. The race to uncover the truth had become a battle, and Ellsworth had just entered the most dangerous phase of the investigation. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The theft of the evidence had cast a long shadow over Ellsworth's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him slowly. methodically as if someone was orchestrating this entire case from the shadows. As he walked into the police station, he was aware of how much had shifted in the last 24 hours. The trust he had placed in the system, in his colleagues, had been chipped away, piece by piece, and the deeper he dug, the more it seemed like someone was always one step ahead. Officer Thompson greeted him with an uneasy expression. "Inspector, we've been through the list of everyone with access to the evidence room. We've cross-checked it with the station's logbooks. Everyone's accounted for, but..." Ellsworth raised a hand. "But what?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "But there's one thing that's bothering me. The records show that no one had logged in or out during the time the evidence was taken. It's like it was erased. I know it sounds impossible, but the logbooks are missing." Ellsworth's eyes narrowed. "Are you telling me that someone is covering their tracks this thoroughly?" Thompson nodded grimly. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like someone knew exactly how to bypass the security systems. Like they had inside information." Ellsworth stood there, absorbing the full weight of what that meant. Someone had not only stolen the evidence, but they had covered their tracks completely. It wasn't just a matter of missing clues, it was a direct challenge to his ability to solve the case. The deeper he went, the more it seemed like the criminal or criminals were playing a game of cat and mouse, always staying one step ahead. He couldn't allow himself to lose focus. Whoever was behind this was trying to bury the truth. But Ellsworth knew better. He wasn't going to let them erase the truth, no matter how hard they tried. He couldn't afford to be passive. If he wanted to solve this, he would have to act quickly, and he'd have to trust his instincts. Even when everyone else seemed to be faltering, his thoughts turned back to Evelyn Blackwood. There was something about her, the way she had been. So poised, so calm despite the circumstances. It was too perfect, too calculated. Was she the one pulling the strings, or was she being controlled herself? Either way, her calm exterior seemed like a mask, and masks always had cracks. Without hesitation, Ellsworth headed back to the holding cells. He was going to speak to Evelyn again, but this time, he wasn't going to play by the usual rules. The evidence was gone, but he could still learn something from her, something that would give him the edge he needed. As he walked down the corridor, the stark white lights flickering overhead, he couldn't help but wonder, was Evelyn Blackwood the key to all of this, or was she just another piece in a much larger puzzle, one that reached further than he could yet comprehend? When he entered Evelyn's cell, he found her sitting in the same position as before, still and composed, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. She glanced up at him with an almost knowing look, as if she had been expecting him. "Inspector," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "Back again so soon. I must admit, I'm flattered by your persistence." Ellsworth didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The receipt is gone, Evelyn. Whoever's been trying to bury this case, they're not stopping. They're erasing evidence and covering their tracks, but I'm not going to stop." Her lips curled into a faint smile, but there was something cold about it. "I suppose you think I'm the one behind it all. I think you know more than you're letting on," Ellsworth replied evenly. "And I think you've been manipulating the people around you, including me. But I'm done playing your game. If you want to walk out of here with your freedom, you'd better start talking." Evelyn's smile didn't falter, but her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, narrowed slightly. "You think I'm behind it all, don't you? You think I'm the one orchestrating all of this? You think I've been pulling the strings from the very beginning?" "I don't know if you're the one pulling the strings," Ellsworth said, his voice firm. "But I know you've been trying to distract me, mislead me, and I'm not buying it anymore. If you want me to believe you're innocent, then start talking." She leaned back against the wall of her cell, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was something unsettlingly calm about her demeanor, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She let the silence hang between them for a long moment before she spoke again. "You're wrong, Inspector," she said softly. "I haven't been misleading you. I've simply been trying to protect myself. And let's be honest, you've been chasing shadows from the start." Ellsworth clenched his fists. "Stop talking in riddles. Who took the receipt? Who's trying to cover their tracks?" Evelyn's gaze remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, a flicker of something unreadable. "You want to know who took it? You want to know who's behind all of this? I'll tell you, Inspector. But it's not what you think." Ellsworth leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, slowly and deliberately. "You think you've been playing this game, but the truth is, you're a pawn. All of you are. The evidence you're looking for isn't the real key. The real key is something else entirely. It's about power, control, and who has the most to gain from this." Ellsworth's pulse quickened. The words she was saying didn't make sense, but there was something in her voice, a note of finality that made him stop in his tracks. "Who?" he demanded. "Who's pulling the strings?" For the briefest moment, a shadow passed across Evelyn's face, a flicker of emotion that she quickly masked. But Ellsworth had seen it, just a crack in her perfect facade. Before he could press further, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Ellsworth turned sharply, instinctively reaching for his gun, but he caught himself. It was just a guard. But as the man stepped into the cell, his face was pale, his expression panicked. "Inspector," the guard said breathlessly, "you need to come with me." Ellsworth glanced at Evelyn, who was now staring at him with a strange, almost triumphant expression. He didn't trust her for a second, but there was no time to deal with her now. He followed the guard down the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever was happening, it was escalating and fast. The stakes had just been raised. Ellsworth moved swiftly through the corridor behind the guard, each step echoing off the sterile concrete walls like a warning. The rhythm of his thoughts kept pace with his feet, heavy and urgent. Evelyn's cryptic words rang in his ears. "You're a pawn." That glimmer of emotion she'd let slip, quickly buried beneath her practiced calm, told him there was truth laced in her manipulation. And now, this another emergency. The storm was closing in fast. They arrived at the briefing room, where Officer Thompson stood near the window, visibly agitated, holding a crumpled sheet of paper. The moment he saw Ellsworth, he thrust it into his hands without a word. The detective unfolded it carefully, typed a neat, impersonal font were just 7 words: "Stop digging, or someone else will die." Ellsworth felt a chill tighten around his spine. No signature, no traceable mark, just cold, deliberate intent. The threat wasn't vague. It was a statement of control. The killer was watching, reacting. And more than that, they were confident. He read it again, slower this time. The phrasing stuck in his mind. Someone else. It wasn't just about Florence anymore. Someone else meant there had already been someone, and someone before her, Clara. Fay. Ellsworth glanced at the note again, then looked around the room, his eyes falling to the crime board on the wall. Photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, all strewn across it in a web that now seemed as convoluted as it was incomplete. His eyes darted from image to image. Florence's still body in the archive room, the broken watch found beneath the desk, the smudged print on the corner of the manuscript. But it wasn't until his gaze landed on Clara Fay's photograph taken over a decade ago, in her university library, that something in his mind clicked into place. A pattern had been eluding him for days. He'd been too buried in contradictions and misdirections to see it clearly. But Evelyn's words had cracked something open. "You're chasing shadows." Not because the trail was cold, but because the killer had wanted it that way. Ellsworth stepped forward, eyes narrowed. The photo of Clara showed her standing by a tall case of leather-bound books, her hand resting on the edge of a particular shelf. In the background, he noticed something odd, an ornate brass figurine mounted to the shelf. At first glance, it had seemed decorative, but now, with everything he knew, he saw it for what it was: a falcon. The same design that adorned the broken watch found near Florence's body. The same motif etched into the missing manuscript's binding. And he realized suddenly with a jolt of certainty the same pattern that was printed on the book plate. Inside the first edition copy Evelyn had denied ever seeing. It wasn't just coincidence. It was a signature. The falcon wasn't just a symbol, it was the thread. He turned to Thompson. "Get me the list of donors to the library archive going back 15 years. Anyone connected to rare book donations, especially anonymous ones." Thompson hesitated. "You think the donors involved?" "I think they never stopped watching," Ellsworth said, his voice tight. "Whoever's behind this, they've been placing pieces for years. Clara, Florence, even Evelyn, none of them were random. This falcon symbol, it's their mark. They've been inserting themselves into the library's history, bit by bit, hiding in plain sight. As Thompson left to retrieve the records, Ellsworth returned to the board, this time rearranging the pieces. He took down the pictures of the broken watch, the manuscript, the old photograph, and lined them up. Each one bore the same symbol. Each one was connected not just to a victim, but to a moment. Moments where the victims got too close to the truth. He thought of Peter again, how terrified he'd been. Not of guilt, but of knowledge. Peter had seen something that night, something he was still too afraid to name. And then there was Amanda, the curator whose alibi had always seemed just a little too tidy. She'd mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd been sorting through new donations in the restricted section on the night of the murder. A vague, forgettable detail until now. Ellsworth froze. Restricted section. That was the one area he hadn't yet searched thoroughly. It was Florence's private sanctuary, curated and managed solely by her. If the killer had been planting artifacts, manipulating the library's collection for years, that was where the evidence would be. Not in the stolen receipt, not in the missing logs, but in the very objects themselves. Within minutes, Ellsworth was unlocking the heavy iron gate to the restricted wing, his heart pounding with purpose. The scent of old leather and dust hung thick in the air. He moved quickly past the familiar rows until he reached the center aisle. There, standing inconspicuously at eye level, was a shelf labeled donations, private collection and cataloged. He pulled down the nearest book. No Falcon, the next nothing. But the third, a slim black volume bound in cracked Moroccan leather, held his breath. Etched into the spine, barely visible except under a certain angle of light, was the outline of the Falcon. He opened it. Inside, the front cover was a bookplate, the same Falcon emblem, and beneath it, in small, curling script, donated in memory of Clara Fay. His fingers tightened on the pages. There it was. The killer had donated this, not anonymously, but under a name that would deflect suspicion, that would blur truth into sentiment. A false memorial, a perfect cover. He turned to the back pages. A folded sheet lay tucked into the binding. As he unfolded it, his eyes scanned. The handwritten text, an excerpt of a speech, a dedication. The ink had faded, but the name signed at the bottom stopped him cold. G. Hale. Gregory Hale, the man Evelyn had kept at a distance. The man who had always claimed no interest in the library, in the books, but whose name now sat on a speech dedicating a volume that had been placed hidden into the very heart of the collection. It had been there for years, quietly watching, waiting. Ellsworth stared at the name, the Falcon, the bookplate, the manuscript. Gregory had been involved all along, not directly in the murder, perhaps, but as the architect, the manipulator, the man who had, for over a decade, been curating a false history. Every clue had been touched by him, and now, for the first time, Ellsworth saw the true pattern. Florence had discovered it. Clara had seen it too. And whoever was helping Gregory, whoever had stolen the receipt, erased the logs, was still out there, desperate to stop Ellsworth from completing the picture. But it was too late. The pieces had finally aligned, and the pattern had emerged. Ellsworth's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Gregory Hale, the Falcon, the bookplate, it had all been there, hidden in plain sight, and yet, somehow, it had never fully clicked until now. Hale hadn't been the one pulling the strings in a traditional sense. He wasn't an eager accomplice, trying to cover his tracks. No, he was something far more insidious. The orchestrator. Yes, but more than that. He was the one who had been weaving the tapestry of lies and manipulation over years, masking his true intentions behind layers of philanthropy and scholarly devotion. Ellsworth's gaze lingered on the bookplate for a moment longer before he snapped the volume shut. The sound of it closing echoed like a finality. He had known there was more to Gregory Hale than met the eye. What he hadn't anticipated was the depth of his obsession, or the lengths to which he'd gone to conceal it. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Hale wasn't just a man looking to secure his place in history through rare books and manuscripts. There was a deeper, darker motive at play. A motive tied to Clara Fay's death, Florence's murder. And now, the orchestration of a cover-up that had been designed to look like a series of random tragedies. But it wasn't random. Not by a long shot. Ellsworth turned back toward the station, the weight of his findings pressing against him. He had to speak with Evelyn again. Her cryptic words were beginning to make sense in light of the new revelations. If Gregory Hale was the one who had been manipulating the collection, then Evelyn had been just another piece of his carefully constructed illusion. But why had she kept defending him so adamantly? What did she stand to gain from it all? As he entered the holding area, the guard looked up. "Inspector, I wasn't expecting you so soon. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," Ellsworth replied, his voice steady. "I need to speak with Evelyn again." Immediately, the guard nodded and led him to the cell where Evelyn sat, as composed as ever, though there was an underlying tension to her posture that Ellsworth hadn't missed. As the door clanged shut behind him, she looked up, her sharp gaze fixing on him. "I suppose you're here because you've finally figured it all out," she said, the faintest trace of amusement in her voice. Ellsworth didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I know who did it," he said, his voice cutting through the air with quiet intensity. "I know why they did it, and I know how they've been hiding in plain sight all this time." Evelyn's eyes flickered just for a second, but it was enough. It was the same look she had given him when he first questioned her about the bookplate. The recognition, the acknowledgement that she understood exactly where he was headed. "You know, don't you?" she said, leaning forward. "You understand now, don't you?" Ellsworth's gaze never wavered. It was Gregory Hale. He manipulated everything: the donations, the rare books, the false history, the falcon symbol. He's been using it to leave his mark, to control everything around him, including you. Evelyn's lips curled into a slow smile, but it wasn't one of triumph. It was something more complex, something darker. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to take a moment to consider her next words. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," she said, her voice almost tender, as if speaking to a child who had finally learned a difficult lesson. "But I wasn't sure you'd ever fully understand." "Understand what?" Ellsworth demanded, a flicker of impatience creeping into his voice. Evelyn's smile deepened, but there was something unsettling about it now. "It's not just about the books, Inspector. It's never been about that. It's about control, power, a desire to create something that cannot be undone." Hale wanted to leave his mark on the world, not through wealth, not through fame, but through the written word, through knowledge, through legacy. Ellsworth's pulse quickened as he absorbed her words. "What are you saying? That Hale killed to protect his collection, to make sure no one discovered his legacy?" She nodded slowly, as though explaining something to a child. "Exactly. Gregory Hale's obsession wasn't about money or fame. It wasn't even about rare books or historical value. It was about permanence. The idea that once something was written down, it could never be erased. And Clara Fay, she knew too much. She was getting too close to the truth about the donations. She had begun to notice patterns in the collection that Hale didn't want anyone to see. Florence, she had become suspicious too, and she was pushing for answers that would have exposed him. They were both threats to his immortality. So Hale did what he had to do. Ellsworth was stunned. "You're telling me he killed them to protect his legacy?" Evelyn's gaze hardened, and for the first time, there was no trace of amusement in her expression. "Yes, Clara and Florence were nothing more than collateral damage in his sick, twisted game. He's a man who could not bear the thought of his name fading into obscurity. He wanted to be remembered not as a businessman, not as a philanthropist, but as someone who had shaped history. The books he donated, the falcon symbol, it was all part of his plan. Each piece was carefully crafted, meant to be discovered long after he was gone, when no one could stop him." Ellsworth felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. "But why? Why keep you involved in this? Why not just eliminate you, too?" Evelyn's eyes softened, just a touch, as if pitying him. "Because I was part of the plan. I was the one who could protect the illusion. I was the one who could make sure the story was told the way he wanted it to be told. Gregory Hale, he couldn't risk being forgotten. He needed me to help him cover his tracks, to manipulate the narrative. But I didn't want to, not at first. It was only when I saw how far he was willing to go, how many people he was willing to hurt, that I realized I had no choice but to follow along. I had no other way out." Ellsworth was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had thought he was investigating a straightforward crime, a murder, a cover-up. But this was something far more insidious. Hale's twisted obsession had cost lives, manipulated others, and created a story that no one could fully unravel until now. And now Ellsworth asked, his voice grim, now that the truth is out, what happens? Evelyn's smile returned, but this time it was empty. Now, Inspector, you finished the story. But just remember, no matter what happens to me, or to Hale, or to anyone else, his legacy will live on, because you've uncovered the truth, and truth, once written, can never be erased. Ellsworth stared at her for a long moment, a sense of finality settling over him. The case had reached its conclusion, but the real story, the one behind the murders, the deceit, the obsession, had only just been laid bare. And as he left the holding cell, a chill ran down his spine. Gregory Hale's legacy wasn't in the books he'd donated, nor in the falcon symbol. It was in the lives he'd destroyed in pursuit of a name that would never fade. And now, the truth itself had become his most powerful monument of all. The weight of the case felt like a burden pressing on Ellsworth's chest as he left the holding cell. He had everything he needed now. Evelyn's confession had shattered the final veil of illusion, revealing the true nature of the man he had been chasing. Gregory Hale wasn't just a murderer. He was a deeply disturbed individual who had spent years weaving a narrative of power, control, and permanence, all in the name of legacy. Now, with the full picture in front of him, Ellsworth knew the time. For subtlety had passed. It was time to end this. Ellsworth headed straight to the station's evidence room, his steps purposeful. His mind was laser-focused on the task ahead. Hale was the final piece, and he had no intention of letting him slip away. He had come too far to let this end in failure. It was not just about justice anymore, it was about stopping a man who could, without hesitation, destroy lives just to maintain his own twisted sense of importance. That he made a quick call to Officer Thompson. Get me everything on Hale, any records, any known associates, no more delays. I need him cornered, and I need it now. Thompson's response was immediate. On it, sir. We'll have the team ready in 15 minutes. Ellsworth's eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on the pictures of the victims and the scattered evidence. Every file, every clue, every piece of information had led him here. He could feel the walls closing in on Hale, could almost see the killer's desperation mounting as his carefully constructed fouade began to crumble. The phone buzzed in his hand. Thompson again. We've got Hale's whereabouts. He's been hiding out at one of his old properties, a remote estate outside the city. No one's been able to reach him for hours. Ellsworth's heart raced. Prepare a team. I'll head out immediately. We're not waiting any longer. He hung up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Hale wouldn't go down. Without a fight, he never would. The detective had seen it in his eyes every time they'd crossed paths. The man wasn't just interested in protecting his collection or his legacy. He was obsessed with controlling the narrative. And when someone like that feels cornered, they'll do anything to escape. By the time Ellsworth arrived at the remote estate, the team was already in position. The property loomed in the distance, an imposing mansion built into the side of a rocky hill. Surrounded by dense trees, its grandeur only heightened by its isolation. Ellsworth could already feel the eerie tension in the air. He stepped out of the car, the gravel beneath his boots crunching underfoot. Stay sharp, he ordered, his voice low but authoritative. This ends tonight. The team moved in with precision, their footsteps barely audible in the night air. Ellsworth, though, moved with a quiet determination. Every instinct screamed that this was the moment, the one that would either solve the case or shatter it completely. Hale had nowhere to run. He was trapped. They reached the front door of the estate, its dark wood and iron framing standing as a silent sentinel to the secrets hidden inside. Ellsworth nodded to his team, signaling them to move. One of the officers carefully tested the door, finding it locked, but it wasn't an obstacle. The lock clicked open with ease, and the door creaked softly as it swung inward. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. Ornate furnishings lined the walls, and the faint scent of old wood and stale air hung in the atmosphere. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Hale's world a carefully curated illusion of wealth, and knowledge was now suffocating him. Clear came the whisper from the first officer. Ellsworth's gaze shifted to the grand staircase that rose in front of them. The silence was unsettling, as if the entire house was holding its breath. He moved up the stairs slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were getting closer. With each step, the tension in the air grew thicker, and then, from above, a faint sound, something moving, a door creaking open, the unmistakable sound of a heavy object shifting. Ellsworth's heart rate quickened. Upstairs, he ordered, "Move." The team rushed up, Ellsworth in the lead. They reached the second floor and swept through the hallway, checking every room, every corner, but there was no sign of Hale. Just when Ellsworth began to wonder if they'd missed him, a sharp noise echoed from behind a door at the end of the hall, the unmistakable sound of something or someone scrambling. Ellsworth signaled for the team to fan out. He approached the door with quiet precision, his hand resting on the handle. Then, without warning, he flung it open. Hale stood in the center of the room, his back to them. He froze at the sight of Ellsworth, his hand trembling as it gripped a gun. The weapon was aimed directly at the detective. Ellsworth's heart pounded, but his voice remained calm, steady. "Put the gun down, Hale. It's over." For a moment, there was no response, just the faint click of the hammer being pulled back. Hale's shoulders were tense, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He wasn't just scared. He was cornered. "You think this will end with me in a cell?" "Ellsworth." Hale's voice was low, almost inaudible. "You think I'll let everything I've built, everything I've worked for, just slip away? I've already written my legacy. I've already shaped the world to remember me. Nothing can stop that." Ellsworth didn't flinch. "You can't outrun the truth, Hale. Not anymore." Hale's face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand, do you? This was never about the books. It was never about the murders. It was about control. My legacy, my name being etched in history for all time. You can't take that from me." Ellsworth took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Hale's. "You didn't need to kill anyone, Hale. You didn't need to destroy lives, but you did it anyway, because in the end, you weren't trying to preserve your legacy, you were trying to control everything, even the truth." Hale's hand shook as he tightened his grip on the gun, his eyes darting between Ellsworth and the rest of the team. "I'll never let you take that from me." He spat. Ellsworth's fingers twitched toward his own sidearm, but he held his ground. The tension was unbearable. Hale was unraveling in front of him, not just physically but mentally. The detective could see the cracks forming in the killer's composure. Hale was losing his grip. This was at the moment of truth. In a flash of desperation, Hale made a lunge toward the window, aiming the gun at his own reflection, as if to deny the reality that surrounded him. But Ellsworth was faster. He moved with a practiced precision, disarming Hale with a single, swift motion. The gun clattered to the floor, and Ellsworth grabbed Hale by the arm, spinning him around. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're done." Hale's expression was one of disbelief, as though the concept of failure was something he'd never allowed himself to entertain. The fight had left him, replaced by a hollow emptiness. His plan, his legacy, all of it had crumbled before him. And as Ellsworth led him out of the mansion, the weight of the case finally lifted. The truth had been uncovered. The final confrontation had played out, and the twisted mind behind it all would face the consequences. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to control. The truth had set them all free. As Ellsworth walked Hale down the narrow hallway of the mansion, his mind already shifted toward the conclusion of the case. It had been a long journey, but the killer was in custody. Gregory Hale's twisted legacy was finally about to be dismantled, his life of manipulation and control undone by the very truth he had worked so hard to bury. For a brief moment, Ellsworth allowed himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. But as the front door of the mansion loomed closer, something prickled at the back of his mind, a feeling that something wasn't quite finished yet. The moment Hale's feet hit the gravel outside, something in Ellsworth's gut twisted. He glanced at his team, their faces just as taut with the strain of the long investigation. But then he noticed something, an officer in the far corner of the yard. scanning the perimeter with unusual intensity. "Thompson," Ellsworth called out. Sharply, his voice firm, Thompson turned, his brow furrowing at the urgency in Ellsworth's tone. "Yes, sir, get over there. Now," Ellsworth ordered, his voice clipped. Thompson nodded and moved toward the officer. Ellsworth's gaze never wavered from the scene as he kept walking, his hand subtly moving toward his sidearm. The weight of something lingering in the air was unmistakable now. The uneasy feeling hadn't faded. In fact, it was intensifying. His mind raced. Had they missed something, a detail, a clue? Hale, for all his arrogance, had never truly been a lone actor. There had been someone else, someone pulling strings in the background. Ellsworth had always suspected that there was more to the case than a simple murder driven by ego. An obsession. There were too many anomalies, too many inconsistencies that hadn't quite added up. As Thompson approached the officer, Ellsworth took one last look at Hale. The man's hands were cuffed tightly behind his back, his face still ashen from the confrontation. For a fleeting moment, Ellsworth thought about what the man had said earlier. "I've already written my legacy." He had tried to manipulate the situation, tried to control everything, and yet, here he was, a prisoner of his own machinations. But then, just as Ellsworth was about to refocus on the case, the officer standing in the corner of the yard began to move. His expression changed from one of concentration to one of panic, and before Ellsworth could react, the officer darted behind a nearby shed, disappearing into the shadows. "Thompson!" Ellsworth shouted, his pulse spiking, but it was too late. The officer was gone. "Sir." Thompson was back now, his face etched with confusion. What the hell just happened? Ellsworth's heart hammered in his chest. "Stay here. Don't move, Hale. I'll be back in a minute." Without waiting for a response, he darted toward the shed. His instinct screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. The case wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hale might have been the face of the crime, but there was someone else involved. The officer's strange behavior, the panic in his eyes, everything pointed to a last-minute twist. He rounded the corner of the shed, the air sharp with the smell of damp wood and earth. The darkness seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if swallowing the yard whole. Ellsworth's footsteps were the only sound in the eerie silence. His hand tightened around his gun as he rounded the far side of the shed and froze. There, standing in the shadows, was the officer, his hands outstretched, holding something small and metallic. For a split second, Ellsworth thought it was a gun. But then, the officer's face was illuminated by the dim light filtering through the trees, and Ellsworth saw the truth. It was a key, a single, unmarked brass key. Before Ellsworth could speak, the officer turned, dropping the key into the ground, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "You shouldn't have come here," the officer said, his voice barely a whisper, laced with an unfamiliar, almost eerie calm. Ellsworth's mind spun. This wasn't right. The officer's face had changed. Gone was the uniformed rigidity, replaced by something darker, more dangerous, something that had been hidden beneath the surface this whole time. "Who the hell are you?" Ellsworth asked, his voice low and controlled, trying to keep the situation from spiraling. The officer smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was the smile of someone who had just won the game. "You think it was Hale. You think he was the one behind it all. You're wrong, Inspector." Ellsworth's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the twist, the revelation he hadn't seen coming. The officer stepped forward, and with a sudden, almost unnerving calmness, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. He handed it to Ellsworth, who took it with cautious hands. The officer's voice was almost a whisper now, as he leaned in close. "You don't understand yet, do you? Gregory Hale wasn't the mastermind. He was nothing more than a puppet. He was the distraction." Ellsworth stared down at the document. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it. The ink was faded, but the words were still clear enough. "Final will and testament of Julian Hayes." A name Ellsworth didn't recognize at first. The document was signed by none other than the officer standing before him, Julian Hayes. It was the final, sealed testament of a man whose existence Ellsworth had never heard of until now. But the more he read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Julian Hayes wasn't just an officer. He was Julian Hale, Gregory Hale's brother. He had been playing a much deeper game, one of long-term manipulation and revenge. It wasn't about the books or even Gregory's twisted legacy. It was about Julian's desire to replace his brother, to erase him from the world's memory and claim everything for himself. "Your brother," Ellsworth said slowly, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. "You've been pulling the strings all along." Julian's smile widened. It was easy. Gregory's obsession with legacy made him a puppet in my hands. All I had to do was guide him, push him toward the edge, and make him believe he was in control. I knew he'd never suspect a thing. After all, he thought he was the genius, but it was me who orchestrated everything. I used his need for power to set the stage. I used his fear of being forgotten to manipulate him into murder. He killed because I told him to. And you, he chuckled darkly, you were just another part of the game, another piece to move around. Ellsworth's breath caught in his throat as the weight of it all settled in. He had been played. The entire investigation had been a smokescreen away for Julian to distract him, to keep him focused on Hale, while Julian himself orchestrated the true crimes. "You killed Clara," Ellsworth said, the accusation harsh. "You killed Florence. It was you all along." "Yes," Julian answered, the calmness in his voice terrifying. "I couldn't let my brother's incompetence spoil everything. And now, with him out of the picture, I'll take control of the legacy he left behind. I'll finish what he started." Ellsworth's hand tightened around the document, his mind whirling. The trap had been set and he had walked right into it. But now he had a choice. He could play Julian's game, let him escape, or he could take control once again. And he knew exactly what needed to be done. Without another word, Ellsworth lunged forward, his hand snapping out to grab Julian's wrist, disarming him with a swift, practiced motion. The game was over. Julian's twisted scheme had unraveled in the worst way possible. As the backup arrived, Ellsworth's mind raced, the weight of the final revelation heavy on his shoulders. The case hadn't just been about murder. It had been about something much darker, about two brothers, one willing to destroy everything for legacy, the other willing to murder to create it. And in the end, it was the truth that had triumphed. Ellsworth stood still, the cold evening air biting through his coat as Julian Hayes was led away by officers. His hands were cuffed, but his expression more frustrated than fearful suggested he still didn't fully grasp that the game was over. The twisted web he'd spun was unraveled, his plans shattered. Yet there was no sense of closure, no satisfaction to be found in the moment. The weight of the case, the deception, the manipulation, the lives lost sat heavily on Ellsworth's chest. It felt unfinished, as though a final piece had slipped through his grasp, just out of reach. He glanced at the distant mansion, the last place he'd ever expected to find the answers, its imposing silhouette now softened by the fading light. Despite the rush of victory, something gnawed at him, a lingering sense that the end hadn't come as neatly as he'd hoped. Julian Hayes had confessed. After all, he had admitted to pulling the strings, to playing with people's lives as though they were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. But even as he spoke, there was an unsettling calm about him. It wasn't the confession of a man caught in the act, but the resignation of someone who believed the game wasn't over, not yet. Maybe it was the glint of arrogance in his eyes or the unsettling way he had looked at Ellsworth when he was dragged away that kept the detective from fully accepting this as a victory. He turned back to Hale, who was still standing at the car, handcuffed but now seemingly deflated, for all the chaos Hale had caused, for all his meticulous planning and obsession with legacy. He was nothing but a pawn in a far larger game. Julian had been the mastermind all along. It was a realization that had come too late to stop the damage, but at least it had come in time to prevent more bloodshed. Ellsworth's gaze hardened. Justice, in this case, didn't feel like justice at all. There was a lingering emptiness to the whole thing, a sense that something had been left undone. Julian Hayes had confessed, but the confession had come with an unsettling calm, like he was merely handing over the pieces for someone else to put together. "Detective," the voice cut through Ellsworth's thoughts. He turned to find Thompson standing a few feet away, looking hesitant but firm. "There's something you should see, sir," Thompson said, his eyes betraying a sense of urgency. "It's about the will, the original one, the one we didn't find until after Julian was caught." Ellsworth's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Thompson stepped forward and handed him a file. It was a smaller document, seemingly innocuous at first glance, but as Ellsworth flipped it open, a new sense of dread washed over him that it was a second will, one Julian Hayes had carefully hidden. It had been signed long after the first one had been discovered, sealed within a safe deposit box. In this will, the terms were vastly different. It wasn't just about Gregory Hale's estate, it was about Julian's control over the entire foundation, over the rare collection of books, and more disturbingly, over the intellectual property of the works Hale had long been obsessed with. This was the real key to understanding Julian's deeper motive. But there was more. Beneath the legal jargon, Ellsworth noticed a clause that chilled him to the bone. The will stipulated that in the event of Gregory Hale's death, or in the event Hale was proven to be the cause of an accident or tragedy, the estate's assets would immediately be placed in the hands of Julian, but with one crucial exception. The original manuscripts Hale had hidden in a secret vault beneath the mansion. It was all beginning to make sense. The vault, the hidden books, the collection had been a smokescreen, a means of distracting everyone from Julian's real ambition to claim his brother's legacy and the secret treasures Hale had kept locked away, thinking no one would ever find them. The truth about those manuscripts, about what they contained, had been hidden behind layers of deceit. But as Ellsworth read the final line of the will, his blood ran cold. There was a clause for one more stipulation. If the documents were ever to be discovered, the finder would be forced to swear an oath to protect their secrecy, or else face the full force of the law. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Thompson's voice broke the stillness. "We thought it was over, sir. But this changes everything. Julian Hayes wasn't just after power. He was after knowledge, too. The kinds of secrets that would have changed everything. Those documents in that vault." Ellsworth stood, staring at the will in his hands, a growing realization creeping over him. The vault, he'd seen the mention of it during his investigation, but never thought much of it. The real power wasn't in the books or the rare manuscripts. It was in those papers, those secrets Julian was willing to kill to keep hidden. "We need to find that vault," Ellsworth said, his voice low. "If there's something in those papers that's worth killing for, we have to stop anyone else from getting to them." Thompson's eyes widened. "But Julian's already in custody. How can we? We don't know if Julian's alone." Ellsworth cut him off sharply. "We don't know who else is involved, and we don't know how deep this goes. We have to act quickly." The team moved swiftly. Though a sense of unease clung to them, they had been under the impression that justice had been served, that the case had reached its natural conclusion. But now, it felt like the investigation was just beginning. Ellsworth led the way back to the mansion, every step feeling heavier than the last. They had to find that vault. They had to uncover the truth before it was buried again, before it could vanish like so many secrets left unspoken. The mansion was just as dark as it had been when they arrived, the silence now suffocating rather than eerie. Ellsworth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the game hadn't ended. Not really. There was still something lurking in the shadows, something that wanted to keep its secrets. They reached the main hall, and Ellsworth immediately moved toward the large bookcase that he remembered from earlier. The vault, he was certain, would be hidden somewhere in the walls of the house, somewhere no one would look. His fingers brushed along the spines of the books, each one feeling like another piece of the puzzle he had yet to solve. And then, just as he was about to turn away, his hand brushed against something cold, a metallic latch hidden beneath a row of thick volumes. His heart skipped a beat. "This is it," he muttered. He pressed the latch, and with a soft click, the bookcase slid open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward into a pitch-black space. The air in the room was stale, as though no one had ventured down there in years. Ellsworth's breath quickened. This was it, the final hidden piece of the puzzle. As they descended into the darkness, the unsettling feeling that had followed him throughout the case returned in full force. What had Julian Hayes been hiding? What kind of truth was buried beneath these walls? And most importantly, who else knew about it? Ellsworth stepped into the cold, dark vault, the faintest glint of something metallic catching his eye. His flashlight flickered over a stack of old manuscripts covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was the final letter, buried at the bottom of the pile, that stopped him cold. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was simply signed, "For the one who knows the truth." Ellsworth's stomach twisted as the weight of the words settled over him. There was no easy ending to this case, not yet, and in that moment, the detective realized justice might have been served, but the real story, that was still to come. Ellsworth stood still in the dim glow of the vault, his breath shallow in the silence. The final letter, signed with that ambiguous "For the one who knows the truth," was the only thing that seemed to matter now. The dust settled around him like time itself had forgotten this place. Yet it whispered a story he wasn't fully prepared to hear. He had expected the vault to contain the secrets Julian Hayes had been willing to kill for damning evidence of. His twisted game, something that would close the case with finality. Instead, he had found only more questions, a letter that wasn't meant for anyone in particular, but for someone who knew the deeper mystery, the one buried beneath Hale's obsession with legacy and Julian's hunger for control, had only just begun to unfurl. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing the faded edges. There was a strange weight to it now, heavier than any confession, a feeling that something deeper, more insidious, was still lingering on the horizon. The case wasn't over, not for him. As he made his way out of the vault, the cold air of the mansion seemed less oppressive, more like a waiting presence, watching him. He had his team search every corner of the mansion for any other hidden details, but nothing had seemed out of place, nothing more than what he had already uncovered. Yet, the faint feeling of unfinished business had followed him from the first clue to the last. The mansion stood quiet behind him as he exited, the wind rustling the autumn leaves scattered across the grounds. His footsteps echoed in the stillness. But even as the case reached its official close, Ellsworth's mind raced, replaying every moment. There was no peace in knowing he'd solved it, not yet. Not while that letter weighed so heavily in his mind. He turned to find Thompson still at the car, waiting to drive him back. The younger officer's eyes were tired, the same exhaustion that had haunted them both through long nights of chasing lies and half-truths. Yet, Thompson's gaze held something else, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Sir, do you think it's really over?" Thompson asked, voice low but edged with a note of doubt. It was a question Ellsworth had been asking himself, a question he had no definitive answer to. "I don't know," Ellsworth said softly, glancing back at the mansion one last time. "It feels over, but you're not convinced." Thompson finished for him. "No, not yet." Ellsworth's voice was firm now, his resolve returning. "There's something about this case that doesn't sit right, something small I've missed, a piece of the puzzle we haven't found yet." Thompson didn't argue, and for a moment, the two stood in silence, the hum of the distant city's lights faintly audible in the distance. It wasn't that Ellsworth doubted the justice system, or that he feared the case might slip away. It was that he could feel something else waiting. There was a ripple in the air, like the calm before the storm, and Ellsworth had learned long ago that when your instincts whispered like this, they were never wrong. "Are we going to keep looking, sir?" Thompson asked, uncertainty still lingering. In his tone, Ellsworth considered it for a long moment. He could see the fatigue in his team, the weariness in his own bones. A part of him just wanted to walk away, to let the case be what it was, a tangled mess that had finally been sorted. But that letter, that last cryptic message, lingered in his thoughts like a shadow. "We need to go back," he said finally, breaking the silence. "We need to check something one more time. I missed something, I'm sure of it." "Another piece?" Thompson asked, eyebrows raised. Ellsworth nodded, his eyes hardening with renewed focus. "A detail. There's always a detail, Thompson. If we don't find it, someone else will, and we can't let that happen." Thompson hesitated for a brief moment before he nodded, his face resolute. "I'll follow you, sir." The drive back to the mansion was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car's suspension. Ellsworth's mind was miles ahead, running over everything again, the pieces of the puzzle fitting into his thoughts like a game he was still in the middle of. He had already found the key to the vault, the confession, and the hidden will. But the nagging feeling of something left unfinished wouldn't let him rest. The mansion was dark when they arrived. The team had already left, most of them heading home for much-needed sleep. But Ellsworth wasn't ready for that. There was no peace in sleep, not yet. He walked back inside. The faint scent of old wood and dust thickened the air. Thompson stayed a few paces behind him, watching as Ellsworth moved through the rooms, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. The manor hadn't changed since the first time he'd stepped foot in it. Still filled with shadows, still holding its secrets. They made their way back to the bookcase, the spot where he had found the vault's entrance. Ellsworth paused, his fingers brushing over the books again, as though expecting something to jump out at him. The space was eerily still, but this time, his hand didn't stop where it had before. It moved further, brushing past the edge of a large volume. A heavy thud barely audible under his fingers. The bookcase shifted, not as a whole, but in an odd, jagged way, as though something had been wedged between the panels. Ellsworth felt his pulse quicken. Slowly, cautiously, he pried the bookcase further open, the ancient wood groaning in protest. Inside, hidden in the dark crevice, was something small and metallic. A box, about the size of a jewelry case, its surface scratched and worn from years of neglect. He reached inside, pulling it free, and opened it with slow deliberation. Inside the box was a simple, old-fashioned key, no different from the one Julian Hayes had dropped earlier. But this one was different in one glaring way. It was marked with the name Florence Hale. Ellsworth's mind clicked, a slow realization dawning. Florence. She had been one of the key players, someone whose role had seemed secondary at first, but had taken on new significance over time. Why would Florence Hale's name be on a key locked away in this vault? A final thought crossed his mind, the one thing he'd failed to consider. It was not about Julian's need to control everything, or about Gregory Hale's obsessive legacy. It was about Florence herself, her past, her connection to the family, and the carefully hidden truths she had kept buried. For the first time, Ellsworth realized the case was never about just one person. It was about a network, a twisted chain of hidden motives and buried secrets, stretching farther than he'd imagined. He closed the box slowly, the weight of the new revelation sinking in. He wasn't done yet. There was more to uncover, and as he stood in the dimly lit room, the faintest flicker of light caught the corner of his eye, as if the house itself had exhaled a breath, preparing for the next chapter to unfold. The mystery was far from over. And Ellsworth knew that, whatever came next, it would be waiting.